Hello, everyone, and welcome to New Hampshire Peace Action's Peace and Justice Conversation series. If you are not speaking, if you could keep your microphone muted, that would be helpful to everyone. This is an every other week series where we do tight 1 hour conversations between 7 and 8 p.m. On a variety of different topics. And I'm going to go ahead and recognize Gene because he's raising his hand here. Did you need to say something, Gene? You're muted, by the way. So just in case, Gene, you can also enter questions into the chat and we'll answer as best we can. We are extremely happy and grateful today to have Denise and Paul Pouliot, who speak for the remaining people who are descended from the people who lived on this land before European colonization. And they have spoken to our organization before and blessed our fall fundraiser a couple of years ago. Denise and Paul, I'm so grateful that you're here. I just want to open up by giving you a chance to talk a little bit about yourselves and your work. And if you could also talk to us a little about the current state of the movement. Today is, by state law, Columbus Day, by an increasing number every year of schools, school districts, cities, and towns around the state is being recognized as Indigenous Peoples Day. And so if you can talk about that movement, where it started, how it's moving, and what's going on with it right now, kind of in talking a little bit about what your work as speakers for the Cowasuck Band brings, that would be great. So I'm going to turn it over to Denise and Paul for a bit.
First, I will start out by saying Kwai Nidobak, Wendelawasin Denise Pouliot, Sagamo Squaw, Woodelawasin Paul Pouliot, Sagamo, Cowasuck Band of the Pennacook Abenaki People, Neona Aiyan, Alton, New Hampshire. Hello, friends. My name is Denise Pouliot. I'm the head female speaker, and this is Paul Pouliot, the head male speaker of the Cowasuck Band of the Pennacook Abenaki People. And this presentation takes place on Quanipi, the narrowing of the waters, or Alton, that's where we're located in New Hampshire, which is located within Indakina, which is the traditional ancestral homeland and waterways of the Abenaki, Pennacook, and Wabanaki peoples, past and present. We acknowledge and honor with gratitude the land and waterways and our ancestors, the Alnambak, human beings who have stewarded Indakina throughout the generations. So thank you for having us tonight. And to answer your question about Indigenous Peoples Day, so far we have managed to change 6 towns, 3 schools, and 1 is duly celebrating both Columbus and Indigenous Peoples Day. We have tried for 3 years to have a bill passed in the State House to pass Indigenous Peoples Day, and we've been met with extreme pushback from the legislature on the whole subject.
Actually, it was pretty much a split line issue with HB 221. It came right down to the wire. It was almost an equal partisan line vote, and it failed to move forward because of that.
Great. So can you tell us, just make a kind of an elevator speech for us, why should we be moving from Columbus Day to Indigenous Peoples Day? And why this particular day? Why Columbus Day?
Well, I'll start with the super basic. Columbus never landed here. Why are we celebrating a guy for discovering a territory he never actually landed on or discovered? Sure, he hit an island down in South America, but he never actually stepped foot here in this region. So the fact that we're even celebrating somebody who was a mass murderer and commit, the atrocities that man did were astounding.
Well, so it was an international movement. It started in 1977. The United Nations Conference in Geneva first proposed this because it's not just North American indigenous people. It's indigenous people of the world who have always been suppressed by imperialism and, in expansion of the world. So this was a movement that was started then. Indigenous people from the United States presented to the United Nations, some of the tribal people that were recognized by the United Nations. And it's been going on slowly since 1977. There's been quite a few states that have already moved that direction. It's really kind of a grassroots movement in itself. It's been spreading across the entire country, and New Hampshire is no exception. And we felt it was time for us. Other states in this region have already, moved in this direction, and I think Maine was one of them. They just went and changed it. Vermont has gone through that process as well. So we're in the same but slower process. And you have to look at MLK Day. It took what?
We're the last state.
We're the last state to approve MLK Day. So
we're just hoping we'll improve and do a little bit better than that.
But we're kind of slow to change things.
Yeah, New Hampshire's very slow.
So Denise, you mentioned mass murderer. Can you talk a little more about who Columbus was and why there's a specific push to address this day as Indigenous Peoples Day?
Well, Columbus was born in Genoa. Italy was not a country until 1865. So people tend to not realize that little bit of history. So as much as people want to say Columbus was Italian, he was not. He may have been born in the area that is now Italy, but that does not make Columbus Italian. Columbus was actually sailing for the Spanish government at the time. He managed to gather the funding through the king and queen of Spain through the genocide of the Jewish population by confiscating their lands and their finances and expelling them from Spain. They then turned that money over to help fund Columbus's exploration. So when Columbus was doing his sailing, he did so under the papal bulls, which basically stated, and this is super cut down, that through the verge of being Catholic, it gave them supreme authority to slaughter or take lands of any population that were not practicing Catholics. And that law is still the reign of the United States today. It was held up in the Supreme Court in numerous occasions, and that's a fundamental problem. So there's a very long history on why Columbus is a problem, why this day is a problem, and why we're focused on this day.
You got to remember, I'm in my 70s, so when I went to school, it was, the rhyme was in 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. And everybody was indoctrinated into that belief. Columbus he landed in Hispaniola. He was actually living in Portugal at the time when he got this great idea of exploration. He probably got it because of the Basque fishermen, which came out of the Iberian Peninsula, had already been to, North America fishing off of our coast. So there was no funding for him. So he essentially looked for where the money was, and he was really he wasn't a prominent Italian. He spoke Spanish. He lived in Portugal for years. And, everybody sort of thinks that Italy was always Italy, but it was Genoa. It was a city-state where he was born, but he had no real connection with Italy throughout his life, other than he was born in Genoa. And, people look at this as it's a propaganda thing. It was always a propaganda thing because, when he started out and he ended up in the Hispaniola, he suddenly realized in his very striking commentary in his ship logs about how these people were so peaceful and loving and clean and healthy, and how great it would be to dominate them and sell them into slavery. And his narratives are really very critical of his behavior.
Read his own diaries. Let him tell you his own story himself.
Even the priests that were with him were questioning some of the savagery of, cutting off hands and feet and heads. And
his own men revolted against him, against his evil ways.
So he was everybody says he's a man of his times. He was a man of his times. He's a merchant. He was an explorer. He was looking to raise money for himself. And he had a deal where he was going to get 10% of all the money. So he made tribute. He actually had people, any island he landed on, they had to bring like a handful of gold every month, or he would cut their hands off. So he was a very serious,
He's a slave driver.
Slave driver. And then everybody says, well, how can you connect him with slavery? Well, he also encouraged African slaves to come to the Caribbean because they found taking slaves from one area and trying to make them slaves didn't work as well as if you moved them off their land, so they didn't know where they were taken. So he started essentially the Atlantic slave trade. And he took slaves from, that started the slaves from Africa to come to the Caribbean, and ended up in the United States. And then he started the slave trade from the Caribbean to Europe. So any accomplishment would be he started the Atlantic slave trade, period.
I think we're better than to celebrate that as a state. I really think we are better as a people we need to just get rid of Columbus Day. He'll always be a part of our history because the atrocities he's committed should always be told. However, celebrating him should be disbanded and removed from our books.
Thanks. And I'm going to go ahead and ask a leading question. Is there a certain kind of slaves that he was particularly interested in?
Oh, indigenous ones, the Caribs down there. He thought we were beautiful and we were great sex slaves at the age of 9. So, I mean, what more can I say about a man like that? It really makes my skin crawl even having conversations about him, honestly.
You really have to read his diaries, his ship logs, and the logs of other people that were with him. Today, it would be rated in the most extreme sense, but everybody tries to whitewash and say, well, that was what it was like back then.
It wasn't like that back then.
You got to expect that. That's the way, primitive Europe was,
No, it wasn't. He was like that. You didn't see the rest of the Europe acting that way, but you saw him acting that way. So, and if he was such an honorable man, then why is he not being celebrated in Haiti, the island and where he landed? He's a demon in Haiti. Hispaniola at the time, but it's Haiti today. So, I mean, I don't know. I'm just frustrated with the whole thing.
It's amazing we have to have these kind of discussions today. But you know what? With race and equality being in the forefront with the, Black Lives Matter issues, this is really something that's been festering even longer than that. This has been festering all through South America, the Caribbean islands, in the United States. This Columbus narrative is strictly propaganda.
Yeah.
Thank you. That covers why not Columbus. Can we talk a little bit about why we do need the other part of the shift? What is it? I actually there's a comment from, I think this was 3 or possibly 4 years ago in the State House. The chair of the committee hearing it said, well, we don't celebrate Indigenous Peoples Day because Indigenous people didn't really contribute anything of North America, didn't really contribute anything to modern society. So I mean, I know when I heard that story, I wasn't in the room. I had a meeting during that committee time. But I know that I kind of flipped out and started talking about all of the different things that the Indigenous people of North America have given to the modern world. Can you talk a little bit about how, I mean, and it really, that the chair of a committee can say that is exactly why we need an Indigenous Peoples Day. Can we talk a little bit about the things that changed the world when steel met democracy and domesticated food crops, essentially, and what that looked like?
First, I would like to say that for the chair of the committee to make those statements shows we have a deeper need for better education in this state. So I'll just put that out there. All right. But as far as Indigenous contributions, I mean, where do we begin? Do we talk about food, maple syrup, squash, beans, corn? The list is just insurmountable. Medicines, games, it's just.
We actually have, when we were doing the educational program for HB 221, we came up with a sheet totally covered, one-sided, but just
small print.
One item after item after item that were contributions.
I wish I had it in front of me. I'd just read it to you.
What we did get from the English is scalping, so that was a good contribution on their part. But as far as contributions, they're just enormous. Not to mention the land and resources which were taken from us, and the genocide that was committed here and other places as well by the efforts of these explorers like Columbus that just didn't care about where they were going. It was all about the greed and taking things back for the king and queen. Today we just got an article from the National Geographic. How do we reclaim our history? Well, this is an important part of our history. We haven't always been a pacifist kind of country. Let's be blunt about this. We've been a warmongering country, and anybody gets in our way, we kill them. Or big stick, we beat them over the head. This goes back to Columbus. I mean, this whole thing with Columbus and the papal bulls, it set in place the planetary authority through the Supreme Court that, in other words, indigenous rights weren't really important because, hey, we had sovereignty as the United States. And in Jackson's time period, they solidified this. They basically doubled down on the narrative that came out of the papal bulls from the 1400s, which said, domination and assimilation of other people's lands, resources, and killing people for that purpose to take those things is perfectly legal. I mean, that was the Pope. They were dividing up the world between Spain, France, and the other royals. And here we are today. We're still living in the same paradigm that was created back in the 1400s. It's shameful.
Thank you. I remember the food was exactly where my mind went first, and some of the other foods that potatoes, tomatoes, most of the foods that we think of as food, that aren't grain, because grass grew in Europe beforehand. Rice is not yeah, but there are pretty much again, rice is essentially a grass. The idea of domesticated food crops, really, that's something that came from this land. Can we talk a little bit about the contributions to government, and how the U.S. Constitution was written, and why Indigenous people need to be remembered when we talk about how our government was formed?
Well, when everybody talks about democracy, they always go to the Iroquois Confederation because that was the biggest and loudest group at the time. But even the Abenaki, the Wabanaki, us, the Pennacook, we had a government of true consensus. All the decisions, and by the way, we were run by our women, not by our men. We were a matriarchal society where the women allowed people like me to speak on behalf of them, because when engaging with other tribal groups and other men, it was always good to have a forceful male orator. But that's why they called me a Sagamo. But back in those days, this consensus government we had was based on peace. That was the first and primary thing. Every decision we made had to maintain peace. You couldn't start it off with a battle. You had to be righteous. So you couldn't be sneaky and underhanded and try to manipulate the vote or the decision by your own personal objectives. And then the third thing was empowerment. We call it power. And that meant whatever decision we made was going to last quite a while, because in those days, I mean, everybody thinks we lived a short lifespan, but everything shows from our own tribal history, our people were living well into later life. We weren't dying at 50 years old or 40 in Europe, like Europe. I have ancestors that can be documented that lived into their hundreds. So, this whole thing of peace, righteousness, and empowerment must have had a strong impact on us. as well as genetics, because we were always trying to maintain peace. And when you read the Jesuit records about us, they said, unlike the Europeans and others, or other tribal savages, as they called it, around the world, the Abenaki were very righteous and very deliberate in the decision making, because they didn't want to hurt anybody, including the colonials that were showing up. So every time we had a skirmish, like they call it, a massacre that we occurred, it was in retribution, kind of like the old Bible, an eye for an eye and a hand for a hand. If they took 200 of us and killed them, we went back and pretty much tried to find out what happened, and we look at these narratives through English eyes, and it was always we the savages. When you look at the French and the Jesuit records, it was just the opposite. They said they were very righteous people and didn't understand the English concept of killing men, women, and children. But the English loved to do that. That was part of the whole thing, the scorched earth, the zero-sum game. They never took any prisoners. Whereas when we took prisoners, we brought them back up to New France, up to the St. Francis River, and we traded them for silver, because that gave us the ability to buy other things. So, we were kind of an interesting group in particular. There were other tribes that were savage. We agree to that. But us here in the East were very civilized.
Thinking about where to go from there.
Don't get me going.
The talker.
I do want to open this up to conversation and let the folks on engage, and you can feel free to either type your question in the chat and I'll read it off, or you can type in the chat that you'd like to ask your question yourself and I can recognize you. So I think I was going to lead us into talking about mascots and the state of that a little bit. So maybe as people ruminate and think about their questions, it's off topic of the main conversation here, but can you talk a little bit about some of the work that you've been doing around school mascots around the state?
Go for it.
So we've been trying to change the narrative around mascots. We're not trying to wipe ourselves out of history, as people like to claim. We want to keep ourselves a part of history. However, we want to remove the things that people use to make fun of us. And mascots is the number one thing that people use to make fun of us. So in New Hampshire, we have 8 schools that currently have mascots, or I should say had 8 schools. We still have 5, sadly, but we are excited to say that we did manage to change 3 schools in New Hampshire, which were Winnicott High School in Hampton, Merrimack Valley in Concord, and we also changed Pentucket High School down in West Newbury, Mass. We did try to change Spalding High School in Rochester. However, they took a vote and decided to keep their mascot, despite the commentary that was made to them, and despite the school board resolutions asking for all Indigenous mascots to be relinquished. So we still have 5 more in the state to change. So if anyone's listening, if you'd like to support, having these mascots changed, we'd enjoy having your letter sent to these schools. One is Belmont High in Belmont, New Hampshire. Their mascot is the Red Raiders. Colebrook High School in Colebrook. Their mascot is the Mohawks. Laconia High School in Laconia. Their mascot is the Sachums. Sanborn High in Kingston. Their mascot is the Indians. And the Wilton Leidenborough High School in Wilton, their mascot is the Warriors. So we're still working on that. Because we had such a difficult time in Rochester with Spalding, there is now discussion about presenting a bill this fall about banning mascots in the state. Some of the commentary that came out of Spalding was so horrific that the ACLU got involved. So yeah, major changes need to be made there. And education, once again, is key. New Hampshire was not a pass-through state. We really did live here.
That's one of the things. When we were working with Spalding Red Raiders, there were actually Indigenous students in the high school, and they said they were targeted with hate. And Spalding already has a policy of no bullying. So they were confronted at the school board level of how can you have a student making complaint about being bullied, being Indigenous, and then still supporting the Red Raiders? Well, it was an interesting issue, and that's why the ACLU is still involved. It just showed the level of that they were working at this point. And there was quite a presentation. This was a major, they actually had what do you call, a petition. Thousands of names were on there to change it. They didn't care. They didn't care at all. They're going to stick to it. So enough said about Spalding. The others, we have quite a few along the Merrimack Valley on the Massachusetts side as well. Highly successful working with them and working through their town logos. Some of those issues are what we call low threshold things, where they used an image of a colonial Indian for their town seal. There's nothing offensive. There's nothing, like a stereotypical image. It's like the wooden nickel.
Right. It's appropriately dressed for the region. It wasn't borrowed from another culture.
We don't look for trouble. We don't try to demand change. We try to proactively work with the towns if they're willing to talk about it. Rochester is not one of those places.
Right.
All right. Well, we do have some questions in the chat, so we're going to kick off with Lindsay Dearborn's question. You mentioned 6 towns have changed to Indigenous Peoples Day. Can you tell us which ones and which states?
Yes, I have a list. If you go to indigenousnh.com, that's a group that we work with, a collaborative group that is trying to reestablish Indigenous history in New Hampshire. And you'll find that there's a blog space there. And if in it, they're talking about the recognition of Indigenous Peoples Day in New England. And in New Hampshire, there were 6 towns: Dover, Durham, Hopkinton, Keene, Newmarket, Exeter, and the schools were Concord, the UNH, the University of New Hampshire, and Oyster River Co-op. And then the dual celebration is Portsmouth, which really that I struggle with celebrating both of them. Yeah.
And not to mention, there's several of them in the queue. We have a whole list
that are still in progress that we just can't report on yet.
No.
So contact your city hall or your town hall.
Let me just explain a little bit about INHCC. It's Indigenous New Hampshire Collaborative Collective. It's made up of retired alumni, historians,
current professors, students,
UNH,
Indigenous people from all over New Hampshire. And our goal is to take the colonial narrative and inject the Indigenous history as well. Most of these stories are told from one-sided viewpoints and never tell the Indigenous side. So they talk about massacres, but they don't talk about the history that went up to that war, that battle. So we're trying to bring that history forward to show, we didn't randomly go out and, just attack people. There were reasons for it. And we can show how many times we tried to resolve issues before things came down to a warlike venture.
It actually started because of place placards, the highway markers along the road. And right there in Durham, right next to the campus, is the Oyster River Massacre. So it started with research with that. And we realized a lot of these narratives that were created and they're dated and not very timely anymore, really didn't tell the whole story. So we created a storybook map, they call it ArcGIS interactive map. And the students loved that because it gave them the tech ability to play with things like mapping and website design. So it just blew up in our face with all the things that the students wanted to do.
Which is fabulous.
And it also helped us create an Indigenous, Native American and Indigenous Studies minor at UNH, because there was so much interest in looking at history from a different perspective and looking through different lenses of what really happened here in New Hampshire. You remember when we were doing HB 221, a lot of the legislators said nobody ever lived here. We even had archaeologists testify that there was evidence that we were here 13,000 years ago. And yet legislators are saying, no, this has always been a tourist vacation place where people only pass through for holidays. They never actually lived here. Well, That's how ignorant our history has evolved. That this state actually, they'd like to say it started with democracy. It didn't. There's a long history well before that.
Thanks. Next question is from either Judy or Arnie. And it is, for a long time, it was believed that the Abenaki disappeared from New Hampshire after King Philip's War and that they moved to Canada. But I've heard that this isn't true, that Abenaki people have always lived here. Can you tell us what really happened?
We blended in. We were your neighbors. There were bounties on our heads, so we had to hide. We couldn't keep running. So we didn't physically look any different than the French or the English. So, people think that we had copper skin and high cheekbones like they did out west, but we didn't have that here. It's written, in the Jesuit records that there was no physical differences between us and them.
Well, yeah, let's get into it. The Jesuits actually said we were the only, as they put it, the only savages that were fully dressed. We never were running around naked. The Jesuits said we had a written language, which we're still trying to research that. They said we were monotheistic. We only believed in one God. We weren't pagans. We didn't worship rocks. We actually had one religion, which was called Gisinowaskom. Greater mystery of all life was one individual thing that we could not explain. It wasn't a man or male or female. The Jesuits had a problem with this because our women didn't like the idea that there was a Christian God who was a lord, a master, a male dominant figure. And it was always the rub we had with the Jesuits because our women said all life comes from women, not from men. So there was always this rift between us and Christianity. Did we accept Christianity? Well, of course we did, because a lot of the things that were in Christianity, like water ceremonies, like baptism, we were frequent bathers. We
taught the Europeans to bathe, and we also taught them to drink water.
I mean, all these things, water is Nibi, Nibi Wozon, and all these structures mean medicine, just like food is based on water as well. So when the Jesuits heard that we actually had water as an important element of our whole spiritualism, they kind of used us and morphed our culture because our stories were like Old Testament parables. And it looked just like the Old Testament. Did we learn anything? Yes, we learned Latin, French, and English from a very early time period. And there's records of that as well, which makes us quite unique to the rest of the indigenous communities across the country.
And let's just pause on that for a moment since Paul brought up language. People fail to recognize that when you read the story of Columbus, they said, "Hello, Englishmen," in English.
This is Pilgrims.
The Pilgrims. They were already speaking English, So we had been to Europe and back, and we had the Basque fishermen here. We had Leif Erikson here. Leif Erikson was here over 1,000 years ago. So he long predated. Let's have a Leif Erikson day. If we're going to, and Leif Erikson never conquered, he just came, traded, and left. He seemed to be a decent dude to us. So
well, unfortunately, they left their genes here because we
did keep some of them.
Believe it or not, we've done our own DNA, and we do have Norman blood in us here in New England. So I'm not really totally surprised to find that out, but just so you know, the earliest contact was probably the Basque, which is Iberian Peninsula again, where, Spain and Portugal are. I have colonial Portuguese in my family tree, as well as the French and Normans as well. And it just shows that the seafaring people from Normandy use those Basque fishermen for the navigation to get here to the New England area. So I don't want to go too far into the history. I'm trying to stay on topic, but I want you to know we never disappeared. There's been some discussion, and if anybody knows about New England was pretty much forested, and if it wasn't forested, we had major forest fires in the White Mountains. A lot of people think that drove out everybody that was living in the woods and everything, but we're already assimilated. There's very strong evidence that because of our complexion, in that we're in a cold temperate environment, melanin.
Manoan.
Yeah, the skin tone was always such like we were Europeans. And when we tanned just like Europeans. But the misconception is we used red ochre in ceremony, and it's like a red clay, iron clay. And we painted ourselves with it like a sunblock using bear grease. So when they saw us and saw us all painted up with red, it was more to keep the insects off of us and the sunscreen. So, you know, we're never the stereotypical Lakota, you know, headdress, riding a pony, you know, shooting buffalo. That was never us. We were hunter-gatherers and people of the forest. So we never disappeared. What we did is we moved around a lot.
Right. And then there were laws that were passed that prohibited us gathering. There were laws that were passed that for scalp bounties. It wasn't until 1978 that we actually got the legal right to practice our own religion. So, you know, everyone else could practice whatever they want since Columbus landed here, but as Indigenous people, we were banned from practicing our own faith. So, we're struggling as Indigenous people. So we really had no choice but to assimilate when your other choice is death. So, we're just trying to do the best we can with what we have left. And we're trying to be upright, moral, and being treated as equals. And so that's what we're going to keep fighting for. Our ancestors fought for it, and that's why we're still here today.
There was a book written by Kenneth Morrison called The Embattled Northeast, and it talks about the 7 paradigms that impacted the Abenaki and why we are acculturated and simulated. And in that list of 7 paradigms, there's obviously the disease, the warfare, the religious aspects of conversion, trade. The 7 paradigms really illustrate what happens when a smaller community is overwhelmed by like a European power. And it's very interesting in how we assimilated, and also through diaspora, we fled New England, only to return later on when things were quiet. Everybody thinks we're always in Canada. We are never always in Canada. All the tribes are along the seacoast because the primary food source back before colonial contact was the fisheries, whether it was the salt water or freshwater, lakes, streams, and what have you. It was a predictable food source, very diverse, and always predictable. In fact, there were fish running all the way through the first ice. The tomcod was the last one to come up, and obviously the smelt and the alewife were the early ones. So nobody wanted to live in the mountains. I mean, after they were done haying and deforesting all of New England, there was no place to really go other than Canada at one point. And everybody thinks we went up to the Indian Stream Republic, you know, North Cowasuck County. Some did, some went into Canada.
Some stayed where they were.
Yeah, but we never really totally vacated the land. Like they say, oh, you gave it up, so we took it. No, it wasn't like that. We were more or less forced out. Hopefully that answers the question.
Yeah, well, we went off a little bit, but that's great. Next question's from Will Thomas. The state legislature recently passed a bill, HB 1135, which mandates that schools must teach the Holocaust and other genocides. Should there be another bill that requires the teaching of the Indigenous Peoples genocide and also the teaching of Black history and the genocide of enslaved Africans? Another great resource is Rethinking Columbus from the magazine called Rethinking Schools, and Howard Zinn's book, The First Chapter, Columbus, the Indians, and Human Progress. So just backing up the question, should there be a requirement to teach what happened to the people who lived on this land before European colonization?
Absolutely. And why was that not part of HB 1135? The first genocide that ever happened on American soil was to our people with smallpox blankets by Amherst. First biological genocide that happened here. Never mind all the pilgrims and everything else that landed prior to that. That just kept wiping out people with disease. So the question is, why were we not included in HB 1135?
By the way,
why is the Black community not included in HB 1135? 2 Holocausts that committed on this soil, and yet we were ignored. That's a fundamental educational problem in this state. That's all I'm going to say. I'm ticked off.
She did raise the question, and we know some of the people on that commission.
Oh yeah, I've been talking to some of the committee members, and they're looking at me like, "Oh my God, I didn't know."
They didn't think about it. They thought Holocaust is only one Holocaust.
There's only one Holocaust in their minds, and there's more than one Holocaust. There are multiple Holocausts around the world, and all those stories should be told.
The Armenians, the Turks. I mean, it goes on and on. How many civilizations were wiped out by others? I mean, even in the days of Columbus, Queen and King of Spain went in this whole thing, getting rid of all of the Jewish communities and taking those resources. I mean, that was a Holocaust in itself that started the whole Atlantic slave trade, because those resources funded what Columbus did. So look at genocide. Oh, it's pretty ugly. It's happened.
And it's rampant. Another missionary just made contact with a lost tribe in the deep forest of the Amazon in Brazil. What do you think is going to happen to those people, all to preach the word of God?
All right, back to your question.
I'm just frustrated. That's just another genocide. I'm just frustrated.
I know
You're hitting all the soft spots tonight, Will.
There was an interesting article. There's a nice little resource guide. It was done by Zinn Education. I don't know if it's connected to the same person.
Yeah.
Abolish Columbus Day Resources and Tools. Very nice little guide. It actually gives examples of how to change school districts, universities, towns, states, and what have you. Really nice little guide, and it's like 12 pages. But Zinn did a great job discussing this. Next question.
All right. Yeah, next question's from Lindsay Dearborn. And you did address the second part a little bit before, so maybe skip that or talk about language a little more in the second part. But the first part is, do we know how many Abenaki are in New Hampshire at this time? And then the second part of the question is, and most people most people fluent in the language? Is it learned at home? Can children learn it in school? And I think after she wrote that question, you answered part of that in a previous question, but maybe talk a little bit about the search for the Abenaki language and written language and where that stands. So the first part, how many Abenaki are here?
Right now, there's an extremely small handful of fluent Abenaki speakers, and we just lost one this morning.
This is an effort to try to revive the language. The problem is we have a lot of resources. It's not a totally dead language. We have a lot.
Right. We actually have dictionaries.
We have dictionaries and language tapes, and we have all kinds of resources. The problem is, if you don't start immersion from the earliest years, it's hard to recognize the language. The language is very descriptive, very interesting. It's all based on like a root word with prefixes and suffixes. And what you expect to be, it's almost like transliteral. You can go left and right to left, and it still makes sense. So it's kind of an unusual language in itself. Most of it, we try to use like the alphabet that we know now, but a lot of them, like the B's and P's are one and the same, T's and D's are one and the same. So when we look at,
like we have the number 8 as a letter. So that's a little different and it tends to throw people off. But the number 8 is like a nasally "on" sound. So it pops right out on a page. But there are some language classes happening up at Newberry College. And I know there's some language work being done on Facebook. And I know there's a website, Abenaki language. I apologize, I cannot recall the website address off the top of my head.
But we have a community. We have 2 communities in Canada, Wollanock and Odanak.
And both offer language courses.
In Canada, those, we call those the mission villages of us. A lot of the Abenaki did not assume Catholicism. And that paradigm is still reflected today, that a lot of Abenaki families would not embrace Catholicism for different reasons. So those in the mission villages still in Canada are still trying to revitalize, keep the language going. I would say fluent first language speakers, a very small number. Second language speakers is probably worldwide, probably 50. The problem is we're having a lot of linguists trying to study our language and pushing out our own people from those resources. So it's kind of a love-hate relationship with linguists. A lot of academics love to learn ancient languages, and unfortunately, a lot of our resources are being taken up by them. What else was your question?
Well,
Yep.
Can I just interrupt for a second? Will, I apologize,
Sure,
but I'm
it's
having
okay.
trouble. I'm having trouble with the chat feature, and I just wanted to add something in to connect into your conversation that Denise and Paul are discussing about the language and the question. Is that okay? To
Yeah,
not just-
absolutely. Go ahead, Jahan.
Oh,
Jump right in.
Thanks, because I apologize, folks, but the chat thing is eluding me. But in the language, this is really interesting because the language revitalization efforts have been very successful pretty much all over the country. And yes, the Abenaki are present, and yes, they integrated in, and it's a slippery slope to get into what people look like and the description of people because of everything that you said, Denise and Paul, about the having to integrate with societies that are subsuming your culture and your people. And there's been lots and lots of this kind of crosstalk with the Mashpee Wampanoag tribe as well, and some Western tribes calling them not Indigenous and that they are Black, and there are all these conjectures. And so in the movement of going forward and in the larger conversation, as an educator and coming toward Indigenous education, I think it's really important that that we maintain staying away from defending what people look like because of that very nature of having to integrate in for survival, and that the focus ought be on the cultural survival and sovereignty that's been able to survive the genocides. And then to the point of the language, one resource I have for you is Peg Spies, who was instrumental in assisting for 25 years. She's a linguist. She's emeritus, but retired, who worked with Navajo Nation in creating their language dictionaries and so forth. So just a resource. And then another fascinating thing to consider in looking at language is that we're actually entering in a period of decolonization. And in decolonization, we have to think about the not just language as a superficial means of communicating with one another, but what were the actual cultural values of the people, and how language was used. So this conversation comes from having it with a Lakota person who has been working with me with language and trying to help me understand that the language is always changing because the culture is, the language approaches nature differently than English. English is a colonizing language. There are nouns in the English language. In many native languages, there aren't even nouns. It's only verbs grammatically because we're in relationship with the earth. We're in relationship with our environment. And so it's important to remind people that are really interested in learning native languages that it's not so much learning, okay, I'm going to take 8 weeks of Spanish and now I can communicate. It's so our whole entire mind has to reorganize itself in learning the language and getting into the deeper immersion, like you were saying, Denise, about how, and Paul, sorry, about how necessary it is to be immersed, because one can learn words and can learn, how to name things in another language. But unless we incorporate the rethinking about the world around us from another perspective, one that isn't of ownership of, or I'm going to learn that because I can consume that information and that makes me able to now communicate, that it's real. Language is tricky because it's so deep. So Thank you. I just appreciate being able to say that and talk with you rather than the thing.
Today,
Um,
today we almost speak like little babies because, you know, people try to analyze like an indigenous language to the to degrees that only researchers go. And, you know, a lot of the things, even a simple thing like needlebar, meaning friend, you know, there were colloquial, there was like expressions that were familiar, like needle means your friend, you're like your loved one. You know, in those little nuances, you know, when a linguist gets a hold of that, they try to make it into different, you know, they try to find
Right, they try to put it in a box and you
It-
can't do that
Yeah.
in languages.
like words like right. In English, it's so ambiguous. You know, really, are you writing? Are you right or left? Are you right or wrong? I mean, in the English language, it was just filled with all these little nuances, and it all depend on the construct. In the indigenous language, it's very finite. You know, it's very descriptive, and there is no wiggle room. If you said something, it meant something. In English, it could mean a whole bunch of things. And you know, that's one of the problems where linguists get involved in our language. They try to put us into these little buckets and analyze every little nuance. It doesn't work. So enough about language.
Great. So Doug McLean asks, is there still hope that New Hampshire may officially recognize any of the tribes in New Hampshire?
Contact your legislators.
Well, the problem is the legislation is very large. There's no particular process for it. There's actually, we're quite content. We went on record with the federal government, with the BIA back in the 1990s. And because of all of the religious freedom and burial of our ancestors, we had to come out of the woodwork because a whole bunch of legislation from the 70s through the 90s said we had to engage with the federal government. So we petitioned as a pre-constitutional tribe, and we really have no strong intention of going through the lobbying thing to get it. So
Yeah,
most tribes can't do it without lobbying. you know.
yeah, and that can get into some ugly territory when you start looking for lobbying funds. And we want to stay on the righteous path and make sure we do things right for our people. So yeah, so we hope to come to the table and have those conversations. We've been active with the New Hampshire government for decades, you know, longer. You know, yeah.
Let's put it this way: the federal government treats us with kid gloves because every time they try to
Right.
oppress us, it becomes
It establishes new case law for the country, so they really try not to do that. We were recognized by George Washington himself, which far predates the BIA, and that puts us in a special category compared to other indigenous tribes. So it's really a large legal topic that you're trying to embark on that honestly in 7 minutes is just not going to happen.
I mean, we could go
Fair
more.
enough.
Yeah.
Yeah. So this is from LR Berger. Can you speak to the push for national legislation HR 84220 on creating truth and reconciliation and reparation for Indigenous people who were sent to boarding schools?
I personally cannot speak to boarding schools, but however, Paul's grandmother was in boarding school. So,
But that was in Canada.
Right. She was in Canadian boarding school. And we know the atrocities are deep and they're extremely real.
See, I was young, so I don't know what the settlement was. I know after the War of 1812, some of my family got land grants on the Chaudière River. My grandmother was put into a boarding school or a nunnery. I'm not quite sure which. It could have been a Catholic environment. And there was some there was some payment given to my family, and we refused it. It was like, we considered it like blood money, and they refused it. So beyond that, I
Yeah,
can't
that
speak.
wasn't that long ago.
My grandmother passed away in the 1960s, and yeah, it would have been late 1800s when she was in these schools. So, and I've met with the Archbishop of Sherbrooke or Quebec back in the day, and I tried to bring up the subject, and he basically showed the sign and turned his back on me. So
Yeah, it's a very touchy subject, and something needs to be done for these people. Families were broken. You know, there needs to be reconnection, and healing needs to take place.
yeah.
Thank you. Swinging around, this will probably be the last question because we're almost out of time. And I'm bringing it back to Indigenous Peoples Day. Will Thomas asks, who will find representatives and state senators to sponsor this bill? And as you answer that, if you could also talk a little bit about the best ways to get involved. If we're most of us are going to be New Hampshire residents, and I think just talking to our state reps about this, having conversations could go a long way. So other ways to get involved, resources, where should people go if they want to help make this push a success next cycle? And I think we're seeing all around the country that these campaigns are working, that a lot of them have had failure after failure after failure to get passed. But we're seeing states go, we're seeing lots of cities and towns go, and that's nationwide. It's being recognized that somebody who was a child sex slave trader, a slaver, a mass murderer should not be recognized, and that the contributions of food crops, which are what sustains most of the planet at this point, most of the food that we grow and use for most of humanity, with the exception, again, as you mentioned, of rice and wheat, is from this land and from the people who were killed on this land, the people who were wiped out, and then the idea of representative democracy, which really came from the Iroquois Confederacy, and these two things, when they hit steel and gunpowder, kind of exploded into our modern world and industrialization, but that contribution is lost to our kids growing up. And thank you for coming and talking to us. Any resources you have for how to help organize around this would be greatly appreciated.
We'd like to take one more moment of everybody's time. Does everybody know there's a monument to Hannah Dustin in Boscawen? Does anybody know about that?
We just got state approval to go in and reconstruct the park and contextualize Hannah and add new historical features to the park, and to beautify it and make it more user-friendly, add a canoe launch and maybe some other recreational facilities at the site. So we just wanted to let people know that that Unity Park in Dakina project has just been launched, and you can find us on Facebook. And you can also find Indigenous New Hampshire on Facebook, and indigenousnh.com, where they'll have more information about how to pass Indigenous Peoples Day in your region. You can find us on Facebook, Cowasuck Band of the Pennacook Abenaki People, or you can visit our website at cowasuck.org to find more information or to contact us. But we would definitely recommend that you contact your senators and your other, state representatives to ask for Indigenous People Day in your town. If you would like assistance in getting that passed in your town, we cannot go into your town and ask for that to be changed. However, you can, and we can go in with you to help that change occur. So we need people to go in and request the change to be done in their town hall. And when this election passes, Tim Horrigan has been our faithful sponsor for the Indigenous Peoples Day bill. And hopefully Tim will get voted in again this year. And we'll look forward to putting Indigenous Peoples Day bill back on the table again. And we're hoping to put a mascot bill on the table this year. So yeah, a lot of legislative opportunities. So, let your—
As far as the federal legislators, we've had FaceTime with almost everybody that's now in either the House or the Senate.
Yeah.
And they've all been—
Support Deb Haaland for Indigenous Peoples Day. She's trying to get that bill in there.
As far as the Hannah Dustin thing, we proposed that we'd be the first in the nation not to tear down a monument, unlike other we just felt that it needed to be contextualized. Otherwise, if you tear it down, we are totally erased from history. And we also know that the site has been, it's an opportunity to narrate history a little bit better. And Hannah Dustin didn't kill 10 warriors. She killed 7 children and 3 adults, and in their sleep. So when you read Cotton Mather, it sounds like she was warring, against armed combatants. It didn't happen. So we want to change the story a little bit, and that's why we want to work on this. And it's a major project for the state as well, and we've got a lot of partners on that.
But
thank you both so much for your time tonight, for sharing with us, for giving us some resources so that we can help pursue this. Want to invite everybody on the call to join us every other Monday night from 7 to 8. Our next forum, or our next discussion, will be with the New Hampshire Immigrant Rights Coalition. After that, we'll have Paul Martin and Lily Dragnev from National Peace Action talking about how we're going to organize for peace post-election. And we have our conversation schedule filled up through December right now. So join us every other Monday.
thank you so much for having us, Will.
We say Gisilini, great thanks, and we'll say Olebam Kani, and it's an expression of travel well and protect yourself, especially in this pandemic. Olebam
You too.
Kani.
You too.
Great.
Thank you.
Everybody.
Night, everyone.